Talk about the good stuff.
Okay. All right.
Okay, here we go. Watch Autoline After Hours live at Autoline.tv every Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 12 p.m. Pacific. You can subscribe to this podcast for free by searching for Autoline in iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube.
Autoline After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, your journey, our passion. Lear, a global leader in automotive seating and electrical systems. Borg Warner, propulsion solutions that support a clean, energy-efficient world. And by DIA MTS, for advanced manufacturing machinery and lightweight components.
All right, Gary.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. We're getting down to the end of the year here. Very close.
This is arguably like our Christmas show. So here's a fun fact to know and tell. You can share this with your family and friends. Well, maybe not. In 1843, A Christmas Carol was published on this day.
On this very day. So we'll make this our Christmas show, even though we will have another show next week.
But that'll be after Christmas.
It will be, yeah.
Christmas is Wednesday.
Yeah.
You better write that. You better write that one down because I think your family would like you to know on Christmas.
Yeah, clearly I need a vacation.
That's right.
So we got to let the audience know who we've got on the show with us today. We've got Joe Langley from IHS Markit. And Joe, great to have you on the show.
Great. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
And back by popular demand, we've got Paul Eichenberg from Paul Eichenberg Strategic Consulting.
Well, thank you very much. It's
great
good to be here again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Gary has prepared kind of a theme for the show or questions, and why don't you take it from there?
So since we're wrapping up the year, we decided we'd get these two guys who know a lot about the industry and just talk about some of the themes and some of the developments that have happened over the year. And some of them happened this past couple days. So
Today even,
that's right. So let's start with this one. Okay. Is Tesla finally gaining traction? Okay, I mean, here's a company that has been around for a significant amount of time, but it almost seems as though they've the Fremont plant is up and running, the Shanghai plant now is up and running. They've identified Berlin as being another place where they want to build a factory there. We've seen the numbers for the Model 3 going through the roof. Even though the Model S and Model X are going down, I mean, let's face it, the Model S was introduced in 2012. I mean, it's like, really? And it's still being sold at all? So, Paul, what do you think of them?
Well, actually, I think that's a great question, and it's a great place to start. So are they starting to gain traction? I would say absolutely. But I think we are just starting to see the emergence of their longer-term strategy. And that's really, if you look at what have they done this past year, is they started to sell car insurance in California, and they're going to start to spread that around the United States. Now, what makes that so unique is they were able to go to a lot of those people in California and offer them deep discounts, because how is car insurance handled today? It's typically you buy insurance and they look at somebody like me and they say, well, here's where you live, here's how far you drive to work, here's your demographic information, and we think you're going to be this type of driver. Now what Tesla is doing with all of the data that they're gathering off the vehicle, they know your driving profile far better than anybody else. And I think what you're starting to see is they're executing that strategy, which is monetizing the data from the vehicle in a way that we're just starting to see that emerge. So I think, have they arrived? Well, I think we're just starting to see really the emergence of their strategy. Another thing that they've done really interestingly is their autonomous driving strategy. They start putting, a few years ago, cameras on every vehicle, and then what happens? Drivers become really the teachers of the autonomous vehicle system. And no other OEM has duplicated that strategy. And this is really, when you think about the data that those cars are gathering, that really puts them in the forefront of that technology. So have they arrived? Is this the time? I think we're just starting to see really the emergence of what could be a very exciting strategy.
Great points. What do you think?
I think so too. Like you said, the traction, is, with Model 3 really kicked it off, and obviously having hiccups here and there trying to get up and running, but the enthusiasm is there for it. And what I'm concerned with for the overall industry is Tesla the EV market? Is it the proxy for the entire market? Because a lot of them have been more on the periphery, as they've come out with models. So it's the kind of the de facto standard, and that's what makes me nervous more for the other OEMs going in, where there's a regulatory push that you need to get there, as well as the vehicles themselves, consumer interest there. But I kind of liken it to if you take a look at somebody like from in the food industry or something, you have you have McDonald's, and then you have an In-N-Out Burger or Five Guy. Well, Five Guys, and that they make the best burger possible, and now you can't have somebody like McDonald's go backwards, because the company cannot sustain that type of radical shift again. Well, Tesla is that startup, and it is all in on electric. And that's why I think it speaks to so many people, let alone Elon is it's a missions-driven company. So then people have gravitated to that. Where, you have other traditional legacy automakers, some of them are kind of defensive plays. Some of them are even outright saying, I'm doing this because I have to, not because I want to. And when we're talking about, innovatives, not even early adopters, we're talking, less than 5% of the potential buyers out there, you have to speak to these people in order to get them to purchase the vehicle. But that's where I think the challenge is for others. But, again, coming back to what you were saying, they have such a head start. When you start to see, and right or wrong, when you look at the spec sheets on some, when you start to hear about some of the ranges and others, yes, traditional OEMs are focusing more on, whether it's more battery pack stability or such, more flexibility to it, where Tesla has the range advantage and so many other fronts as well, let alone being so vertically integrated. We're kind of moved back, in many instances, Elon has had to take that approach, because early on, how many suppliers really wanted to work with the company? But now, he's kind of taken by the reins these adoption problems. So, we've called it like the 5, or I think it's now up to 7 stars of alignment that need to happen. And Elon has just said, I'm going to make that happen. Infrastructure is a problem, supercharger networks. You have insurance or other issues, we'll make that happen too. So I think, that traction is really just starting, and then next year we'll have Model Y, and I'm not seeing any reason why that shouldn't succeed either.
Yeah, also today, very signal day for Tesla. Shares traded at over $400 a share. The market hasn't closed as we do the show yet, and we'll see if it closes above 400. Remember, it was $200 a share, 230 lower back in, I think it bottomed out this year, May, June, something like that. 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, a company called Baron Capital predicted that Tesla would go to $500 a share. And the Teslarati were all over, they love that. The rest of the market, this guy's crazy. Well, guess what? $500 doesn't sound out of the realm whatsoever. And Baron Capital is now saying it's going to go to $1,000 a share. So, has Tesla arrived? I think we're on the verge of a major blowout by the company's stock, certainly.
Well, okay, so what I was wondering, okay, when you're talking about McDonald's, as being, which is a good metaphor for this, but okay, if suddenly people start wanting a certain sort of thing, McDonald's automatically has the scale. So when we look at companies like, let's say, Mercedes or Audi that are playing in the space that Tesla is, I mean, don't they have the advantage from the get-go that they know how to make stuff and they know how to make a lot of that stuff and they know how to get margins and as we've seen, Tesla doesn't seem to have that all worked out yet?
Yeah, no, I mean, like you said, the legacy does have that advantage, especially on the manufacturing side. That's the unfortunate part, I think, with Tesla is that, we could have been producing at such higher levels than where they are today with embracing the legacy industry. But they do have that part, but I think the problem is they're are lagging behind on Tesla on a number of the technologies. It appears, when you have some of the between some of the German executives and outwardly praising some of the Tesla products, whether it's the battery packs or some of the other technologies. I mean, most recently, even Porsche saying they were impressed with how impressed they were with Autopilot. That's really telling. And on top of these organizations, I think the fundamental problem for them, though, is the bureaucracy and that hierarchy and that structure where Tesla doesn't have that. I think that's where these startups have that advantage on top of, getting into the psychology of that buyer, that defensive play where you have somebody like Mercedes, Daimler with such a rich heritage, but, the weird dichotomy is that, you have an EQC launching, but then there's going to be like the 1892 or something edition. So you have these two things at play here that I think are going to be challenging for legacy.
I think I would add one thing there. We did some research this past year, and we did a number of expert interviews with OEMs. And specifically, we were talking to an OEM about that centralized domain controller architecture that you have, like in a Tesla, that allows you to gather data from basically every electrical system there. And they were talking about that being a 7-year process with the hierarchy and the fiefdoms that they have within their own engineering organizations to duplicate that. So I think what we're starting to see as a result of, again, the Tesla strategy, you're starting to see OEMs get far more aggressive at going after that. So GM, if you just think about GM have come out and said, we're not focused on hybrids any longer. We're going straight to battery electrics. VW did the same thing. And I don't think that's just because of the push for electrical vehicles. That's for the push to be able to compete with that type of strategy. That's why you see Argo, that's why you see Cruise aggressively driving this robo-taxi strategy to compete with the Tesla network. And I would tell you, probably 18 months ago, I wouldn't be talking as high as I am on Tesla because I just saw it as like what you're talking about. All that they're really making was an electrified vehicle, and this electrified vehicle, once the other OEMs decide to do that, there's really not a sizable advantage. But look what they've done with the Autopilot. Look what they've done with the Tesla network. Look what they've done to change the business model of the automotive OEM. And I think we're just starting to see really that strategy emerge. And you are seeing other OEMs basically committing to saying, we've got to duplicate that same strategy.
Moreover, I'd add real quickly here, you asked about scale, Gary. Let's just look at batteries. Let's look at electric motors. Let's look at inverters. Let's look at electrical architecture. Who's got the greatest scale?
Yeah.
Tesla does. The others don't even come close. Added up all together, they don't even match its scale in those items.
Well, and those are electronics, just scale so differently. So, and I think when you come from the traditional automotive supplier side, and you make these huge investments, there's not a lot of scale there, but electronics, it's all about scale. And what they've done with the gigafactories and partnering with Panasonic and everything they've done there is really to drive competitive advantage, which it'll be interesting if they can maintain that as others come into that market and bring other scale.
Well, that raises an interesting point. So now you have, there's any number of other startup companies that are saying that they plan to have electric vehicles, and you know, they roll one out and you see it and it looks really nice, and then somebody else rolls one out and has a giant screen. And, you know, I mean, and so we're seeing all of these. At this point, they're basically vaporware, but at some point they may become real. Is there the possibility that they could beat Tesla at its own game?
Oh, that's a great question. Now, I think if you think of Rivian and think about what Rivian did at the beginning of the year, they raised $1.5 billion on top of what they'd already raised. They got GM and Ford to battle to be sort of that secondary investor behind Amazon. And I really see legs to that strategy because what I was talking about earlier, what they've done is they've, for the past 5 years, been developing that skateboard that is now going to be something that Ford can scale into their pickup truck market. And there's an advantage there. There's an advantage like we talked about before because most OEMs can't do that like that. And the OEMs were late to see the advantage beyond just the electric vehicle, what that enabled to drive mobility, to drive autonomy, to drive the connectedness of the vehicle, and all the other data strategies that are going to come from those vehicles. So if that's where you see the market going, the Rivians of the world, I think, are a great avenue for some of these OEMs to leverage. Will they beat them at their game? I don't know, but they're probably going to have electric pickup trucks and a platform that's going to be highly valuable and probably highly successful because of the way they're coming at the market. And there could be another company like Hercules. Hercules is looking to do the same type of thing. So that's a smaller startup that's looking at sort of that mid-size pickup truck segment. So these platforms will become very valuable going forward. And we'll be able to leverage some of that Tesla strategy as a source of advantage.
No, I love what you were just saying with Rivian too. I mean, it's a great exercise with Ford's investment was really smart. It allows them access, to learn from them, and obviously, how do they work? What are they looking at from an outside the box point of view without this legacy, structure? Kind of free reins. What can we do out there? So that's, I think, is one great thing. So, and then conversely, Rivian can learn some manufacturing. But I think what I find fascinating is the potential, the business model for Rivian is, they're open to sharing the skateboard. So you're talking about lowering the barriers of entry. I mean, this industry is insane, but the idea that somebody can come out there and say, hey, I got some investors and we want to build some electric vehicles.
But that's
like
what that's what we were just talking about. Think about that. They make the skateboard available. They make it available, and then it becomes somewhat of a standard. So if you think of the MEB platform, the MEB platform's already got, 80 vehicles planned for it? So you start thinking about that scale of those common components that you have there, and what that does to the competitiveness of the electric vehicle going forward. I mean, it's huge. And I think we did a study in 2017, and what we were looking at was what is the cost of a motor, an inverter, and the gearbox associated with an electric vehicle. And we looked at that, and it was about $2,000 in the marketplace.
In 2017?
In 2017.
And what's it today?
It's less than $1,000,
Right.
and it's an integrated system. Wow. So instead of individual components, it's starting to be integrated into one unit, okay? And think about that. And where's the damn scale? I mean, the market hasn't even taken place, and that's just the competitive factors coming into this in this market. So I think, again, somebody like Rivian could really be a winner by opening up that platform and saying, hey, have at it because of this issue that we're talking about as far as scale.
All right, so let's move on, and this is something that is just like...
Well, if we're going to move on, why don't we take a quick commercial break right now, because that's a good stop point. So we're going to give out a shout-out to our friends at Lear and Borg-Warner.
Lear Connexus offers a parental controls application with geofencing that sends notifications regarding driving behavior and location, including curfew alerts, acceleration alerts, and speed alerts. all delivered to a smartphone application that includes vehicle location, driver notifications, and a report card of driving history, including notifications when predefined geographic boundaries are crossed. For more information, visit Lear.com.
The world is changing at an ever-increasing pace. No matter what the mode of transportation, there is always the need for an efficient propulsion system. And that's exactly what BorgWarner has been doing since the earliest days of the automotive industry. We create innovative mobility technologies that reduce energy consumption and emissions while improving performance. Our proven track record has made us an industry leader in forward-looking propulsion solutions for combustion, hybrid, and electric vehicles.
All right, we're back talking all things automotive.
Okay, so on to a different but related subject. So, Paul, you mentioned the MEB platform, which,
yes.
for those who are not familiar with that, that is the development that Volkswagen has come up with to be the basis for their electric vehicles. And, okay, so in July of this year, Ford and Volkswagen announced that they were going to be getting closer together, including, and you earlier mentioned Argo AI, which was the
big issue then.
the autonomous vehicle development operation that Ford has heavily funded, and Volkswagen is going to be putting $2.6 billion into Argo AI and bringing in its German research facility and make that part of Argo AI. Okay, and then there was also the discussion of sharing medium-sized truck platforms in Europe. Okay, so here's the question. Do you guys think that there will be those two companies getting closer together as we go into the future?
Yeah, I do. I think when you start to, well, first of all, I think they started to move into this at the auto show last year. There was the announcement, and then the big issue was, well, how do you value Argo? So they spent 6 months trying to figure out that. And of course, this investment that you talked about is driving the valuation of Argo. I think now it's, they figure it's about $7 billion is the value of Argo. But when you start to think about where the market is going longer term, these organizations have agreed we're going to develop robo-taxis together. Again, we're going to invest in this electrical vehicle platform together. You start to see the end game of this as far as what is a winning proposition in this future market. How do they start to separate this technology? Well, this is critical to me. This is critical to you. How do you do that without moving closer and closer together? And I think this is what we're going to start to see in the marketplace is, BMW, Daimler, they've started to come together. And I think you recognize the investment that is taking place here for these automakers to change their business model is such a huge bet, and it's such a huge investment that I don't know how you do this individually. And that's why you see sort of these companies going in this direction together, and then you see companies like Land Rover, Jaguar sort of out here, without a partner, or Honda, making investments in Cruise, So I think you're starting to see a separation. That technology is, again, driving the change in the OEM model, and it's just forcing collaboration on a whole new scale.
Yeah, exactly. I think, I compared to just, outright, mergers, definitely nobody can go it alone. Just regulatory, compliance, let alone all the technology and get in there, let alone the rapid cycle and development of it, you just can't go it alone. So we could see more, OEMs looking at, what are you good at and what am I not so good at, and vice versa, and we can get some of those relationships. So Ford and Volkswagen, we don't have the scale and pickup, you do, so in this region, so you could see a lot more of that playing out. And interestingly, with the whole PSA and FCA working to emerging, or memorandum of understanding to do so, you could see potentially larger OEMs, like you're talking about a Honda of this world, but they're big, but maybe not big enough. But they're not small either. So you have this kind of trap where they're going to need to work with somebody. And some of these companies are fiercely independent, and they're not used to it as we move into this world. So that's, I think, is going to, the coming year and next few years will be really telling on, let alone who they align with on the technology front.
Yeah, and I think what you're going to see for the OEMs, it's like they talk about in sports, basketball. Are you going to be a pro team that tanks so you get the best draft picks, or are you going to be, a team that's, always an elite winning team? But the teams that are in the middle are just in a wasteland because they never get the opportunity to reinvent themselves. And if you look at this space, who's in that wasteland in the automotive space? It's these type of companies that we're talking about. Jaguar, Land Rover, they don't have the scale from Tesla to really leverage in other areas. You can say Honda's in that. There's a number of companies that are in that space that just don't have the scale. And that's why if you look at Ford, you look at FCA and PSA, these aren't traditional technology buyers, okay? And again, I think they're starting to look at what is that strategy, what does that future state look like, and how far are we willing to go in that to participate? To the extent, do we see a Tesla as sort of a competitor, or do we see it much differently and just a whole different type of buyer it's going to be pushing us? So I think all that is really starting to play out right now before our eyes as far as the strategies from the OEMs.
So why are we seeing FCA and PSA getting together? I saw John on TV, by the way, talking about that, so I'm going to be interested in what he has to say today.
Yeah.
What do you?
So I think it's just a matter of competitiveness. I think it's a matter of scale. I think for these organizations, especially the opportunities they have to drive synergies in Europe, it's significant. And when you're competing on manufacturing margins, like this industry does, you've got to find that. Because let's face it, they're not investing in technology. You see this at the OEM level, you see it at the supplier level. If you're a supplier, or if you're an OEM that's not investing in technology to differentiate, you're a cost player. And in this day and age, if you're a cost player, where are you seeing advantage? Okay, let's face it, over the past 20 years, this industry has been leaned out globally. So where else are you going to drive cost other than consolidation? They've squeezed the supply base. This is where it's going to come from. So for those who aren't going to be technology players, there's not a big playbook for these organizations to have.
So it's basically they're getting together so they can just take advantage of economies of scale, full stop.
Exactly. Yep. Well, I think that's a lot of it. I think that's a lot of the driving factors behind that.
Where do you see it coming from, Joe?
Yeah, same thing. A lot of the scale, a lot of behind-the-scenes cost saves as well. So you get obviously hugely increased purchasing power among the supplier community. What's interesting, though, as I found, was it's almost like you're doubling down on Europe, though. So you have a very expensive environment in terms of labor and the regulatory environment, and then the double down kind of seems, it's better that they do it together than separate. But still, for PSA, you create kind of these three islands that are happening around the world. You have North America, Europe, and China, and together they have a better odds of trying to grow in China than they do separately. So that is going to be a big part of it, because both of them are pretty weak and lagging in China. So this will potentially be a good opportunity to work forward in that market, let alone down the road. I mean, we're still looking at a merger that's 12, 15 months away, and from what I understand, they basically still have to act as competitors, so they really can't do anything or realize any synergies until mid-2021, when they could start talking and planning together. So when you start looking at some of their portfolios, you get into a kind of a time crunch of when can we start consolidating and, say, sharing platforms, but then you start getting back to FCA in North America is vastly different from a product and footprint perspective versus PSA. So I think that allows for a lot of, separate autonomy. And kind of another trend we're keeping an eye on is the idea of, of regionalization again, because you have these 3 islands that, from a consumer point of view and even regulatory, there's some variability there, that you can't create a one product for the globe anymore. But again, you move to electric vehicles, you have a skateboard, and you can create basically a top hat that fits that region at a much better, price point than you could have if you had to design an ICE-based vehicle. So I think that is a good opportunity going forward.
John, what do you think about that combination?
I agree with both these guys. FCA probably wasn't going to survive on its own. It has not been investing in electrification. It's got this little deal with Waymo, but that's not the same as investing in autonomy. Peugeot's done, to my knowledge, almost nothing in autonomy. It's stuck its toe in the water in terms of electrification. So put the 2 together, split the cost of doing it, go with a skateboard or whatever, it makes a lot of sense. But is that going to mean it survives long run? Let's see what happens. We've seen other companies try to get together. They couldn't get the cultures to mesh. Ford and Volkswagen could even run into that issue as well. Let's see how it goes. Yeah. It's really going to be paramount in this case with PSA FCA. For Carlos Tavares to really make sure the cultures come together. And remember, he worked for Carlos Ghosn, and we saw a lot of window dressing that made it look like Nissan and Renault were getting along palsy-walsy. Now we know that wasn't exactly the case. Well, Carlos was there, first-hand view of it. So he's got a second shot at a go-around on this. That should help him a lot to figure it out.
So for those who are in the U.S., is Chrysler going to survive Chrysler, the brand?
The first thing I would say is even back to the days at Magna. When I was at Magna, of course, spent a lot of time looking at the acquisition of Chrysler. And back then, you talk to any investment bank, you talk to any hedge fund, what they would tell you, the value in the organization is Jeep. I think, 10, 15 years later, where's the value in this? It's in Jeep, okay, in Dodge pickup trucks. And beyond that, that brand has little value. And if you start to look at what the rest of the market has done to get rid of the small cars and everything else and just really focus on Jeeps and SUVs, where's the value of Chrysler? That's where the value of Chrysler is.
Yeah, I think that's where the big problem is. Obviously, you're gonna say that we're not getting rid of any factories or any brands or anything, but the hard questions are going to have to be asked. What is the long-term play for a Dodge, a Chrysler brand? You just look at Lancia in Italy, and it's pretty much gone. But I think that there could be potential again in the medium term. You keep it around, but over the long haul, could you morph it into something that changes in terms of a business model brand? Like they're trying to position it as an MPV brand. Well, can you move it into a ride-sharing service brand? Something like that, where you can leverage an instantly recognizable name. But in terms of the long haul, the portfolio is down to 2 vehicles basically, and then same thing when you get to look at Dodge, it's muscle cars, which the regulations basically have to either go all EV to keep that kind of muscle car image. But the days of Hellcats, from between now and 2030 are pretty numbered.
Yeah, what I'll be interested in to see is Carlos Tavares has wanted to bring the Peugeot brand back to the American market. Wow, lots of luck with that. Yeah. What's it cost to establish a brand name through advertising now? Hundreds of millions of dollars just in advertising. What astonishes me is Kia will tell you today 40% of the car buying public doesn't even know about the Kia brand. Right. And they've been in the market for years. Yep. So if I'm Carlos Tavares and I wanted to sell Peugeots in America, wouldn't it make sense to rebrand them as Chryslers? And now you start to expand the Chrysler brand, and at least you've got a network, you've got a name. All of a sudden, people will see Peugeot makes some very nice cars. You know, all of a sudden, even though the car segment continues to shrink, it's probably hit bottom. If Carlos is so adamant about selling Peugeots in America, I would advise badge him as Chryslers and grow the Chrysler brand, and that would save that brand. Not that you should do it to save the brand. I mean, it's business at the end of the day, but that would be my strategy.
You know, one of the things, just to add this, because we've sort of been talking around it, is one of the things that we spent a lot of time this past year looking at is robo-taxis. And what you're starting to see as a result of, again, as we talked about earlier, the Tesla network, Cruise, Argo, sort of looking at, you know, we're going to make this urban mobility vehicle that's autonomous, it's electrified, you know, in driving that strategy, there's really starting to be three strategies, long-term strategies for the OEMs. And the first one is that robo-taxi. Here's the end state that Tesla is showing everybody. And for Cruise, Argo, you know, Ford, VW, GM, et cetera, that's an end game for them. That their model is shifting from just being a car manufacturer to a fleet operator, especially in that urban environment. The second one we see is like what you were talking about, FCA and PSA. And this is like you have with the airline industry. So you've got Airbus and you've got Boeing that are making crafts to the specs of somebody else. And who are going to be those people speccing those? It's like you said, it's Waymo with Google, you know, it's Lyft, it's Uber, it's these type of organizations that want to continue to, you know, become fleet operators and control that relationship with the consumer, again, especially in those urban environments. And then the last one, which, you know, I think we'll eventually talk about, are those who are going to be just truly luxury car makers. And this is BMW, this is Daimler. They originally got together and said, hey, we're going to pool our efforts together. We're going to develop L4 mobility together. We're going to do a robo-taxi. And what have they done in the past 6 weeks? They've stopped the robo-taxi development. They said, hey, you know what? Let's renew who we are. We're a luxury car maker. So you're starting to see Volvo in that category. You're starting to see these strategies emerging from the OEMs. And we see it, what is their, you know, software strategies? How are they working with suppliers? How are they partnering? And these are the three models we'll start to see really emerge over the course of the next decade. But clearly, FCA and PSA are in that middle category. They're going to be making the Waymo vehicles of the future to somebody else's specs.
Well, you mentioned Daimler and BMW, and Reuters came out and said that they think those two companies should merge, and that, you know, both of those companies have recently announced, you know, drastic cuts because of the amount of money that they need to invest in automation and electrification. Does a merger like, and then plus you have the situation of, you know, we now have 17 months in a row that China sales have gone down, and China is a big chunk of the luxury market now. Okay, so suddenly BMW and Daimler are saying, you know, we're not having so many cars sold over there, and we've got all these expenses. We've got to. So, what is the likelihood of something like that happening in the next decade?
You know, again, I go back to it. I think there's a real solid chance that that's going to happen. And the reason being is because, again, we've talked to many OEMs, and many OEMs believe we're at a real turning point. We're not all going to survive this technology disruption. And that's why some of them are being very aggressive to say, hey, how do we handle this? And I think if you start to look at Daimler and BMW, I mean, you know, think of BMW. BMW has, for autonomous vehicles, they've partnered, they've built an alliance with a number of suppliers. So they've got, you know, Continental, Magna, Bosch, Aptiv in this. For level 3 systems, they're partnering with Aptiv. For level 4 systems, they're partnering with Daimler. You know, so you look at this, they don't have the ability to build, you know, they don't have the scale. Okay, and you know what? The fact of the matter is Daimler doesn't either. So why do they have to partner? Why do they have to come together? Because they've got to find ways to leverage this investment that VW, who's producing 10, 12 million vehicles, can afford to make because of just the scale that they have versus, the scale that Daimler and BMW have. I don't think they have any other options.
Yeah. No, I think, and then another point, I think that the electrification and moving to, let's say, a skateboard environment, this is where, branding becomes key. BMW and Mercedes, very strong brand images globally and, very consistent too. But when you get to a skateboard, is battery chemistry going to matter to a consumer? The inverter? So many of these things are going to be commodity-like devices. So instead, I can focus on giving you the BMW experience, the Daimler or Mercedes experience, by sharing some of the same architectures, because you're back down to software and all those touch points that I can still deliver something for you. So I think EV could potentially, you put the two companies together and they could leverage that and still be very, very distinctive in just using the software and technology at play. And it's again, we're moving into a fascinating point in time, coming back even to the idea of Rivian, where you have a platform, and I've kind of likened it to, Rivian, powered by Rivian could be the 2020s, 2030s Intel Inside.
Yeah.
Type
I'll give you a different viewpoint, though. I think we're entering a decade where, by the end of the next decade, scale could be a disadvantage. Scale is really expensive. It's massively capital intensive. And the more vertically integrated you are, the more capital intensive it becomes. I think we've already hit peak auto. I think the all-time record sales that was achieved in the United States in 2017 will never be surpassed again. And the reason I say that is, there are 50 million more people living in the United States today than they were in the year 2000. 50 million. Car sales are the same. They have not gone up at all since the year 2000. And in fact, on a global basis, sales are going down right now. I don't think it's just because of a global slowdown. And if you look at all these new mobility services, down to like the electric scooters that are coming in and new ways of people going to be able to get around, concern with climate change and all this other stuff, I could see, as we see fewer and fewer cars being built, now it's not going to be a plunge off a cliff. This industry is going to be pretty healthy for a while. But all of a sudden, if your business model is predicated on scale, what happens when scale goes away? Or scale doesn't even have to go away. It just has to diminish a little bit. It's just got to drag you down to that 80% capacity utilization in your plants. You're not making any money anymore. So I think when you look at where Tesla's at, with a market valuation that is absolutely crazy on a fairly small, one assembly plant.
Yeah.
They're just getting going in China. They're going to go to Europe.
Right.
But because of all this technology of the over-the-air updates, their own insurance, no dealerships and the like, they've completely changed the business model. I think the bigger they are, the harder they're going to fall.
The thing that struck me about all of this conversation is that, we're basically making an argument that an industry that has been predicated on the internal combustion engine and people driving behind a steering wheel with pedals is going to be supplanted by electric motors and NVIDIA processors. Okay, and if you look at the numbers of electric vehicles being sold now, I mean, it's basically Tesla, right? And and that's what, 5% or 2%, 3%?
Of the U.S. market,
Of the US.
1.4% are battery electrics this year.
So, I mean, it seems somewhat inconceivable that this change could occur. Of course, if I'd owned horses back in the late 19th century, I might have said the same thing about the...
But I guess for me, I think you're at a real tipping point. Because again, if we go back to VW, and VW alone, think about it. They've got 80 vehicles, electric vehicles planned.
They've bet the farm.
Yeah, they bet the farm. $90 billion investment
If this doesn't
in
work,
electrification.
end the Volkswagen.
You're right. Now, again, I was involved in a few billion-dollar investments, and frankly, you do your homework. So you've made a $90 billion investment. They are tied in with the regulators, whether they're in Germany, whether they're in Europe, whether they're in China, wherever their major markets are, they know what's going to happen. And I think we are at really, as you said, a monumental change in our industry. I think the last time I looked at it from the IHS data, there's about 158 battery electric vehicles that are going to launch over the next 3-4 years out of the top 10 OEMs.
Right.
I mean, think about that.
Right.
Globally. I mean, so yes, I get it. And yes, there is this whole ecosystem that we're used to, but we're on the verge of a huge change. And a lot of it's being driven by governments and regulatory bodies. And I think that can't be underestimated too, what that's going to do to change this industry.
Yeah. Hey, look, Joe, we got to get your idea on this, but we got to take a quick commercial break. So right now we're going to give a shout out to our good friends at Bridgestone and DIA MTS.
Whether they're electric, autonomous, or connected, tomorrow's cars must be developed quickly with the highest precision, and they have to be lightweight. DIA MTS can provide what you need, from advanced manufacturing machinery to lightweight components. Learn more at our website at www.d-iamts.com or visit our showroom right next to Metro Airport in Detroit.
All right, we're talking all things automotive, the end of the year, the end of a decade.
Yeah.
So, Joe, you were going to say something about the transformation that some of us may be skeptical about?
Well, yeah, I mean, we are too. Our forecast is pretty, it seems bearish. I mean, trust me, I hear from clients on both sides of the equation, OEM and supplier, about expectations. A big part of it, though, is where we are right now and what we need to do to get consumers into them. And again, that comes back to, policymakers. I'm not in that area, but you can get into the rights and wrongs about subsidies, but clearly there's a link between subsidies and adoption. So that far we know. That's a separate argument about, what's right or wrong. But to help that along, we've seen that play out. And when the subsidies disappear, so the demand dries up. So that part can help drive it. The other one, and this is an interesting one we're hearing a bit more and more of, is, governments now have to play this balancing act of, yes, we want to help the environment, CO2 and regulations on that front, but then at the same token, EVs need far less manufacturing jobs. And you're seeing this, so you have to play this careful balancing act as a government agency, somebody like Germany saying, hey, Volkswagen's bet the farm. We need how many X amount of fewer manufacturing jobs over the long haul.
Well, and I think that's another thing that we're starting to see. We talked about this a little bit earlier. So we did some analysis for a client looking at this, and this time this time last year, there's been 65,000 layoffs at the OEMs. That is all based on the restructuring. And basically in the press releases, what the OEMs will come out is there's predominantly three main reasons. They say in Europe, the slowdown of the market there as a result has resulted in this. But more times than that, they say it's the impact of electrification. Okay, or the digitalization of the business. So these are the three primary reasons. And as you said, 124 moving parts in a internal combustion engine. There's less than 25 in an electric vehicle. There's far less labor that's needed. And I think what you're going to start to see is this is only the beginning at the OEM level. Why? Because so many of them now have come out and said, we've stopped engine development. Yep. We've stopped transmission development. We're just focused on what it's going to take for us to meet this 2030 legislation out of Europe. So as a result, you're going to start to see a trickle effect from that it's not just going to be Audi, it's not just going to be Daimler, okay? It's not just going to be GM and Ford. It's going to continue to spread as a result.
Okay, one of the things we talked about earlier in the show was the fact that Tesla is able to do things that others aren't doing because they don't have the legacy, right? And I'm looking at, I mean, if we look at the website of any OEM in the world, you go to this one thing that'll say plants, and they all have this long list of engine plants and transmission plants and assembly plants and part plants. Okay, so here's this highly conservative industry, and it's like looking at that and saying, we got a lot invested there. We're going to blow that all off? I have a hard time believing that there's anybody in the industry that would say that they will.
Well, but look what GM has done in the past couple of weeks.
Yep.
They've gone back to Lordstown. They're making a huge investment with LG. You know, they're partnering battery electric vehicles. I mean, who would have ever thought? Okay, and what are they saying about the market? They're saying, you know, you put in one of these gigafactories, you know, whether you're picking up the whole price tag or you're splitting it with somebody like LG, these are billion-dollar investments. So again, are they sitting there saying, well, we're going to dabble a little bit? No, they're not. They know where they're going. They know where the market's going. And this is why I think, again, you start to see where is the money being invested. And, you know, this money started to be spent some time ago, and it's just continuing to accelerate. And that's why I think we're just starting to see the restructuring that's going to come from these OEMs, and then it's going to trickle down on the supply base here over the next couple of years. Because even a couple of years ago, we were talking to some companies that's, let's say, 90% in the transmission space. Like, we're not quoting new programs. Okay? Now think of 3 years of engineering teams sitting around. Not that that business is going away, because these are annuity type businesses. You know, somebody's got to be around to make the last few transmission gear, you know, pinion gear sets or whatever. But at the same time, the engineers who are doing all that development work, they've served their purpose. So I think, you know, this is why this is going to be really more of a decade of restructuring for the whole industry, because you just don't need the amount of people.
So will this be disruptive reorganization?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I mean, think of GM when they came out and said, hey, we're getting rid of 7,000 of these workers, specifically with these backgrounds. You know how many people they've probably hired out at Cruise? You know? I mean, it's the transformation of the workforce. Okay, so what do they need out there? They need people who are software developers. They need data analytics people. They need computer science people. You know, IT specialists are now really core to an OEM and their future strategy. I don't need guys who are, you know, gear cutters.
No, I mean, that's been the trend. You go back to, you know, you go say the UAW peaks in the mid to late 70s, and it's been a downward trend since then, just with automation. But, you know, EVs takes it to another level. Just the sheer lack of the number of parts are significantly less, and you could do so much more at each factory. So, I mean, you look at the most recent UAW agreements, and trying to maintain those workforces is pretty challenging, let alone when you hear some of these investments, even, you know, from other automakers that, hey, we're going to invest, you know, $300 million, $500 million, or $1 billion, but they're only adding, you know, 200-300 jobs. You wouldn't have imagined that decades ago. You know, it's incredible what in some factories feel like ghost towns to a degree. It's like, where are the humans? And the trend forward is all about software. And look at Tesla's the perfect example. They just started offering, what was it called, something like Speed Boost? So for $2,000, you just basically bought yourself a little package that unlocks another, you know, half a second of 0 to 60 time. I mean, what did that? There's nobody wrenching anything, putting a different motor in it, nothing. We're moving into a very different world, and This is where it's funny, the idea that from the things that Tesla's offering is stuff that typically fits with the buyer who would be muscle car, performance, BMW, those types of things. But it's getting the butts into the seat, so to speak, to feel that. Because once people have been in them, most of them don't go back. And I find myself, even every time I've driven an EV, it's obviously still a car, but the experience is very different. Whether it's a more pedestrian version that's not meant to go burning around town, or a higher end Tesla, it's just a completely different experience. And I think you feel like you're driving the future. Mm-hmm. And the key thing is getting that to the consumer and getting them to understand that. And I think EV is probably more sellable to a consumer too, because hybrids were kind of like, what is it? Like, you go to the Chevy Volt, and the hardest part was explaining it to people. What, is it an electric, non-electric? Well, this just eliminates that whole discussion, even though at the end of the day, you can get into a separate discussion about having a range extender and all that. But, that was just a complex thing for mass buyers, and EV is not that.
Paul, you mentioned Lordstown, the investment,
Yeah.
$2.3 billion that GM and LG are going to be investing. And when I read that, I said, they closed down the Lordstown assembly plant, and now they've made this announcement that they're putting this facility in Lordstown to sort of make nice with the community, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so General Motors has a strike, costs them on the order of $2.9 billion. Mm-hmm. Was it worth it?
I think it all depends on what side you're on. And again, I think they probably got more in the area of what we're talking about and the freedom to execute that strategy than commitments to the union. And I think, is there a price tag, on that? I think that was very valuable for GM at the end of the day, because the freedom to operate, and again, the freedom to operate was probably a big deal for them to go through.
Yep. I would say too, it's like timing is everything. I think from a GM perspective, the timing of this contract was no good. Everybody is pretty much figuring sales are slowing down. We're off of that peak from a couple of years ago, and we're not going to get right back there. At the same token, we're still in a healthy environment that you just can't say to the union, we're going to close 5 factories, whatever. You still have to give something. I think it was actually a very fair deal, and I was surprised it actually went on as long as it did. Especially when you consider there's still a number of GM plants that are underutilized. As they start paring back some of their portfolio on the car side, like every other manufacturer. But then again, it offers opportunities down the road for, as they want to expand their electric portfolio. And I could see, especially if you get to mid-decade and beyond, vehicles start to transform, whether they get an all-new nameplate or, switches over what we're used to.
Yeah, let me just add one thing too, because, when you move from the internal combustion engine to these electrical systems, and I think the Bolt is the perfect example. The Bolt is the perfect example, because 56% of the purchase content that goes into the Bolt comes from LG. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they're making the electric motor, they're making the battery packs, they're making all the power electronics. Yep. They've even been able to leverage the infotainment system into that, because they're making such a huge, investment on behalf of the OEMs. Now think of this going forward. Instead of the OEM investing billions in dollars to develop engines and transmissions, that investment can be spent on software engineers to develop, not just electrical, but autonomous vehicle strategies, connected vehicle strategies, to be able to start mining data in a whole new way that the industry's never really seen. That transformation is so huge of an opportunity for the OEMs, because again, the internal combustion engine has been sort of the mainstay investment of the OEM. Now you free them from having to make that, and you've got companies like LG, Panasonic, CATL, you name it, anybody in this space who's going to come in and invest in that power electronics, the battery pack, all that on behalf of the OEM, think about what they can transform themselves into. I think that as you start to look at a strike like GM had, and that freedom to be able to move in that direction is huge.
But getting to your point, Gary, $3 billion. I mean, on the face of it, I think it was a failed labor strategy. But there was a special case this year, and that was all the UAW corruption.
Yeah.
All the labor experts I've talked to have said, no question, the strike went on as long as it did because the corrupt union leaders wanted to drag it out because they knew as soon as it was over, boom, they're getting thrown out of the union and going to jail. And they haven't gone to jail yet, but they're going to, the guys at the top, like Gary Jones. So this Detroit-based industry has got to figure out how it's going to deal with the union. The union's got to figure out how it wants to survive long term. Because a $3 billion loss for 1 month of shutdown is completely inexcusable. It weakens the entire region. You know, look how many suppliers got hurt by this. How many people that worked at those suppliers that lost a month's worth of income. Maybe they got a little bit of unemployment, but they lost big time. So the union's got to start looking at the bigger picture here, and the industry's got to figure out how it's going to do it. I don't know what the answer is. Maybe it's binding arbitration. You know, get rid of this nonsense of going out on a strike because it is costing the Detroit-based automakers and it's costing the union in the long run. This is not sustainable against enemies, if you will, who don't have these problems, competitors who don't have any of these issues with the union, and they operate right here in the United States. So it's another one of the things that's going to have to be dealt with in the coming decade.
All right, so near as I can tell, there are 2 auto companies we haven't talked about. I think we've talked about every single other one besides these 2. Toyota and Nissan. So, what's going on with Toyota? Do you see, how do you see what they're doing now, and how do you see going forward?
Well, yeah, Toyota's really interesting. I kind of, stepping into this coming year, I think you're looking at strong cadence for them. You know, you just started seeing new products and redesigns coming. So, this year and the next couple of years will be very strong for them. But when we step back into our lens of EV autonomous, it's almost pretty much like Toyota and Honda are kicking and screaming about moving to EV because their plan all along was to go from hybridization to fuel cell.
Right.
And now this is being interrupted, and they are kind of being late to the party. And the most incredible statement was just, I think, last week or two, I believe it was Bob Carter, who said he's expecting electric Armageddon because so many are invested in it, and he doesn't believe there's enough buyers out there for this glut of electric vehicles. And he may be right, and I share some of the similar sentiment that at this point in time, there's going to be so many EVs and maybe not enough buyers. We're seeing already with some of the new models arriving that it hasn't panned out as robustly as, at least here in the U.S. for some of the entrants. But yeah, Toyota will still move in that direction, but I think they still don't view the technology, at least on the battery front, as being mature enough for every day. And obviously their statements fit with their own, with their agenda or where they are at this point in time. But I think for them, at least when you put them in that role, they're a little behind the ball on that front. But again, they're going to have to try to work with partners as well on some of these technologies. You just, a lot of them, you can't just go out there and, start doing your own autonomous by yourself. You're going to have to find a partner. That's why somebody Honda is working, more closely with GM and some of their entrants because, they can't afford to do it themselves. So Toyota on that front. Then you look at Nissan. Nissan was there early with Leaf, but we never had any follow through. There was such early commitment to it. But, now we're kind of backtracking to it, so I could still see them there, but they have enough other corporate issues to deal with. Like you said, for the past 10 years, it's kind of been a race to the bottom for them, and a lot of bad practices they have to start unwinding and kind of relearn as an organization. Who are we as Nissan, as a company, as a brand? Where do we fit in this world? And we all know you can sink a brand in a few short years with some bad practices.
Right.
We've seen it before, all of us, but it takes decades to fix that again. And I think that's where, unfortunately, where Nissan is going to be for a few years.
But if you look at Toyota, again, as you were talking about, Look what they did this year. They announced a consortium with Denso, Mazda, Suzuki, you name it. I mean, they brought a lot of organizations together. Panasonic was another one. What were they going to do? They were going to partner together to bring this electric vehicle technology into the marketplace. They were a lagger, okay, because they did, as you said, they wanted to invest in the fuel cell, and they thought that was the game changer, but they got caught by electrification. But what are they looking to do? They're looking to leverage their scale. They need that to compete. That's why they bring all those organizations together to say, hey, let's make this investment together. Now you look at Nissan. What's Nissan? Now they've got Renault. You know, that's, you know, a tough relationship right now. They're much more between Renault, Nissan, and Mitsubishi. They're much more in that situation like what we were talking about, FCA and PSA, okay? And it's just interesting, if you look at, you know, Renault has a relationship with Waymo. You start to look at what they're doing there. A lot of similarities. That's why I say you're really starting to see where are the OEMs going to fit in this next decade as far as what type of strategies they're going to be pushing. They want to just be making cars. Hey, we want to survive this. We want to make cars, et cetera. Much like in a similar manner of FCA and PSA. So I think Toyota is going to be much more moving towards where a lot of these other organizations are that says, hey, I think even they came out maybe it was 6-8 weeks ago, a strategy of here's our connected network. They developed this strategy. They had a huge investor day that was just around Toyota connectivity, what we're going to be doing. It looks a lot like what you've seen from Tesla. So you're starting to see they're going to be in that spectrum, trying to compete there to say urban mobility, especially, you know, somebody like Toyota sees, you know, the idea of mobility and autonomy and what that does to an aging population and their base market is critical. So you see that urban mobility piece starting to come out of them that they're going to go after. But again, they got the size and ability to compete for that. They got the loyalty in markets like Japan that are core to their business. So I think you're going to see them in that category, and then you're going to see Nissan, Renault, you know, sort of where we were talking about with FCA and PSA.
I'm surprised that you think that there would be companies that would be sufficiently self-effacing whereby they would say, we're providing white goods that will be private labeled by whomever. I mean, I just think that the egos in this industry are too big for that.
But I mean, look who's partnering with Waymo. Look who's, you know, who's working with them. And ultimately, if you believe that customer connection that's going to come in that ride-sharing model is based on the data going back and forth and that exchange you have there, how is somebody like FCA or PSA going to invest to control that kind of customer relationship? Especially when you were talking about earlier, that whole investment in the brand. I mean, basically what I can see from these organizations is stop investing heavily in the brand that way, because you don't need the brand differentiation. You're selling, you know, you're selling Airbus or Boeing to Google, to Uber, to Lyft. All that cost can start to shift to somebody else who's really investing in that identity and that consumer relationship in a very different way. So,
Hey, look, we are towards the end of the show here. We haven't taken any calls from some of the callers here. I should mention Alexander Karabitsa says he doesn't see any of these mergers we've been talking about happening unless the corporate cultures actually mesh. And we touched on that. But Carmen, why don't we bring in a couple of those calls and end with the one from Dale?
Hey guys, this is Danny Youngblood, Cleveland, Ohio. First of all, the important stuff. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays to all you guys.
Happy holidays.
You're doing a fantastic job. Quick question. Along the way, along the last year or so, you had some promising different engine manufacturers like the opposed piston, opposed cylinder, Opach, and then there's an Acades Any updates on that, or are they just going to fade into the sunset? Have a good one. Take care. Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, young blood. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, all that kind of stuff, too. Yeah, OPOC, that's dead. They didn't get off the ground. Acades, what do you think, Gary?
Well, they continue to develop their technology, but I mean, I would be surprised if we see it in vehicles as much as we see it in stationary.
Well, Paul, you just
generation.
mentioned a critical thing earlier in the show.
Yeah.
The major OEMs, we're probably not going to see a clean sheet engine from them ever again.
No.
So who's going to invest in, okay, maybe it's a terrific piston engine. I just don't see the investment going there.
Well, I think the one thing I would add is this, is if you look at basically in Europe where the legislation exists, by the end of next decade, it's 59 grams of CO2 per kilometer. And that is the equivalent of about 80 miles per gallon, okay?
And even more importantly, banning ICE from city center.
But basically, when you think of today, the Golf is 120 grams, okay? So you cut that in half. Basically what it is, it's already a ban of the internal combustion engine, okay? Because how does the Golf remove all the mechanical properties to get there? Those technologies just don't exist. So it's already like it's a ban of the internal combustion engine to where these OEMs have to get, specifically in Europe. So.
Okay, we got another phone call. Carmen, let's bring that in.
Greetings, everyone. This is Dale Leonard out of Cleveland, Ohio. And John, I want to take this time out to wish you, Gary, your guests, the whole staff and crew at Autoline a very Merry Christmas and a happy, healthy New Year, and a thank you for your wonderful generosity. Take care. Great show as always.
All right.
Hope to be giving you the same message in December 2020.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Real good, Dale. We hope that you'll be there too. And is that it, or do we have another?
This is Clem Zarowski in Delmont, Pennsylvania. Not too long ago, I saw an article done by a European think tank says that for a electric vehicle to become emissions-free, it doesn't happen until it reaches 85,000 miles, because they started out with the emissions caused by digging the stuff to make the battery and all the way through. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're right, Clem. That was by an Austrian company called AVL that did a well-to-wheel study. They looked at all the emissions generated from pumping oil, right out of the ground, all the way to turning the wheels on a car. They did the same thing, like you said, for electric cars. And what they specifically said is that because an electric vehicle, especially from the battery standpoint, the battery is so energy intensive to manufacture that it rolls off the assembly line with a gigantic carbon footprint. To catch up to a 48-volt mild hybrid ICE car, it has to drive 70,000 miles before its carbon footprint matches that of the mild hybrid. And then after that, it does drop below it. But good point. Yeah, you got a great memory there.
I guess one of the things that I've seen is the EPA's done something similar, where they say, hey, with a pure EV, we give it a 0, as far as the rating. However, if they go well-to-wheel, it's closer to a 50. As far as the type of rating that they would give it. So yeah, it is significant. But again, if you start to think about where the Golf is today and where the Golf needs to get to, again, that electric vehicle is a significant improvement.
It totally is.
And one could argue that Toyota was right, because the fuel cell's got a better well-to-wheel than these other things do. So Larry Burns actually was the one who was early work there in terms of
Former head of R&D at GM.
Yeah. So let's see. Larry was all about hydrogen, and Larry was all about the skateboard.
Yeah.
Way ahead of his time.
Yeah. And autonomy.
And autonomy. Yeah. I mean, and they got rid of him.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to wrap this up, but Paul Eichenberg, thanks so much for being
Yeah, my
back here.
pleasure.
It was really cool having you. And Joe Langley from IHS Markit, terrific having you on the show.
Thank you very much.
And Gary, we got one more to go.
We do.
And then we're going to start a new decade.
New decade, incredible.
And I hope all of you will join us for that ride.
Autoline After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, your journey, our passion. Lear, a global leader in automotive seating and electrical systems. Borg Warner, propulsion solutions that support a clean, energy-efficient world. And by DIA MTS, for advanced manufacturing machinery and lightweight components.
Visit our website, Autoline.tv, where you can watch us live Thursday afternoons. Get your daily fix with Autoline Daily and in-depth analysis and interviews with Autoline This Week. There's all that and much more at Autoline.tv.